The moment he saw the police cars approaching, he began stripping off his clothes, and by the time the officers broke down the door, he was completely naked, showing that he carried no weapon that could threaten them. Yet from his calm eyes and steady steps, it was clear the real game had just begun. Soon, inside prison, he would challenge the entire corrupt and decaying American judicial system. The unsuspecting police discovered piles of law books in Shelton's home, leading Nick to assume he was a lawyer, until he came across a photograph of himself shaking hands with Darby 10 years earlier, the very Darby who had been brutally dismembered just days ago. It was then that Nick suddenly remembered Shelton's true identity. Once an ordinary law-abiding man with a beautiful wife and a clever little daughter, his life was shattered the night two burglars led by Darby broke into his home. While one accomplice ransacked the valuables, Darby unleashed a frenzy of violence, stabbing Shelton, tying his hands behind his back, and arrogantly declaring that he could not defy fate. Darby then humiliated and murdered Shelton's wife before his eyes, and even his 6-year-old daughter could not escape the monster's grasp. Miraculously, Shelton survived, and the two criminals were soon captured by police. Believing in justice, Shelton placed all his hopes in the law, only to discover that the true darkness was just beginning. When he begged Nick to seek the death penalty for both men, he was met with a cold response. Due to lack of evidence, the only way forward was to strike a deal with Darby, letting him testify against his partner so that at least one of them could be sentenced to death. Shelton could not accept such an absurd outcome, for otherwise he would never be able to face the memory of his murdered wife and daughter, but Nick's reply struck him like a crushing blow. To prevent both criminals from walking free, they had already signed a deal with Darby, and that was simply how the justice system worked. In that instant, Shelton was overwhelmed by a sense of powerlessness, realizing that these so-called enforcers were driven by KPIs, by the need to maintain high conviction rates, and by the urge to close cases quickly, even if it meant making deals with murderers. Days later, the court delivered its final ruling. Darby's accomplice was sacrificed as the one sentenced to death, while Darby, backed by connections and rewarded for turning in his partner, received only a 3-year prison term. At the signing of the agreement, he wore a smug expression and even repeated to Nick the same line, "You can't fight fate." Outside the courthouse, Darby once again sought out his savior, Nick, shaking his hand with a wide grin in front of a crowd of reporters. Nick could only respond, but watching from a short distance away, Shelton saw it all, and in that moment his eyes were filled with utter despair. 10 years quietly passed, and Nick had become a father, living happily with his wife and child. In his heart, he felt no guilt whatsoever about the case from years ago. Instead, his career had flourished through plea bargains and deals with criminals, eventually elevating him to a leadership position. Darby, meanwhile, had long since been released from prison and spent his days idly enjoying life at home. The only small comfort for Shelton was the news that Darby's accomplice was finally set to be executed by lethal injection. Nick and his colleagues gathered outside the window to observe, expecting a calm and quiet procedure. But when the 3 syringes were slowly pushed into the prisoner's body, he suddenly convulsed violently, veins bulging, and died in agony with screams echoing through the chamber. The shocking scene immediately drew the attention of the authorities, and afterward they discovered that the drugs had been switched beforehand. Written on the vial was Darby's infamous catchphrase, "You can't fight fate." At the sight of this, Nick was instantly reminded of the case 10 years earlier, and suspicion fell squarely on Darby. A massive police operation was launched to capture him. At that moment, Darby was lounging comfortably at home, grinning maliciously as he watched the news of his partner's gruesome death, but then he suddenly received a mysterious phone call warning him that the police were on their way. At first, he thought it was a prank, but when he saw patrol cars outside, panic set in. He fired several shots at them and fled onto the roof, escaping in a panic. Following the directions of the mysterious caller, he sprinted wildly through the streets, eventually shaking off the police pursuit. He ended up in a deserted courtyard where an abandoned police car was parked. Spotting an unconscious officer inside, Darby snatched the cop's gun, punched him awake, and forced him at gunpoint to drive him to safety. Using the police car, Darby managed to escape deep into the wilderness, and fearing that the officer might lead others to him, he decided to kill his driver. Just then, the mysterious caller phoned again, and to his shock, the voice on the line belonged to the very officer sitting beside him. As Darby stared in confusion, the cop removed his disguise, revealing himself to be Shelton. Realizing the danger, Darby immediately pulled the trigger, but the gun had already been tampered with. The moment he squeezed it, sharp spikes burst out of the grip, injecting a powerful toxin into his body. The poison wasn't lethal, but it paralyzed him completely, leaving him unable to move. Soon after, Darby was taken to an abandoned factory and strapped down to a surgical table like a patient. Shelton connected a heart monitor, tied a tourniquet, and injected him with large doses of glucose and adrenaline to keep him fully conscious. To amplify his suffering, Shelton even suspended a mirror above him so Darby could watch everything. Once all was in place, Shelton switched on the camera, picked up a chainsaw, and began his brutal work of vengeance. Before long, Darby was tortured to death, but even his gruesome end could not erase nearly a decade of pain and hatred. When it was done, Shelton calmly walked away, ready to begin his next plan. Meanwhile, Nick received word that the suspect Darby had been found, only he had already been cut into more than 20 pieces. With both culprits of the old case now brutally slain, Nick instantly realized the prime suspect had to be the other man tied to that tragedy, Clyde Shelton. The police immediately launched an operation to capture him, but Shelton seemed to have foreseen it all. The moment he heard the sirens, he calmly stripped off his clothes and surrendered without resistance, allowing the officers to take him effortlessly into custody. Through the investigation, Nick discovered that the factory where Darby was brutally murdered was actually one of Shelton's properties. Over the past 10 years, Shelton had obtained multiple patents and used the money he earned to purchase numerous abandoned factories and warehouses. Though the purpose behind these acquisitions remained unclear, to Nick the case seemed straightforward. A man who lost his wife and daughter, dissatisfied with the verdict, took justice into his own hands and killed his enemy. All that was left was to follow procedure and convict Shelton. But things turned out to be far more complicated than he imagined. During interrogation, Shelton repeatedly stressed that he had always wanted both criminals to die horribly and had even made countless plans to kill them by various means. Seeing how quickly he was confessing to motives, Nick prepared to wrap things up and leave, but then Shelton suddenly stopped him, saying, "I only said I thought about it and planned it, but I never actually did it." On closer reflection, Nick realized that Shelton had indeed only admitted to intentions and motives, not provided concrete evidence. This left Nick stunned. It was a clear exploitation of legal loopholes. Determined to uncover Shelton's true purpose, Nick sat back down to continue, only for Shelton to mock him, saying, "Don't you like making deals with criminals? If you want me to confess, arrange better prison conditions first." Such an outrageous demand shocked everyone in the room. Nick, feeling humiliated, cursed in anger and stormed out. The district attorney was furious at Nick's refusal, insisting that a single prison cell was a small price to pay for a full confession, the easiest bargain they could ever make. But Nick was convinced Shelton was merely toying with them, until a single phone call changed everything. While Nick had been conducting the interrogation, his daughter at home received a DVD. Thinking it was a recording of her recent performance, she played it, only to be horrified by the graphic footage of Darby's dismemberment. Terrified, the little girl screamed. Though deeply unsettled, Nick still clung to hope and asked whether the criminal's face was visible on the video, but unfortunately Shelton had worn a helmet during the entire act. Now fearing for the safety of his wife and daughter, Nick had no choice but to agree to Shelton's terms and make a deal. The next day, the guards delivered the soft bed Shelton had demanded, sparking resentment among the other inmates, and the warden warned him not to try any more tricks. Meanwhile, Nick remained on high alert, ordering a full investigation into Shelton's activities over the past decade. To their surprise, Shelton had no permanent residence, no job, and his properties revealed no useful leads. Even stranger, his bank account regularly received contract payments from the Department of Defense. What Nick thought would be a thorough and conclusive investigation only grew more confusing. Adding to his shock, despite having received the bed he wanted, Shelton still refused to plead guilty in court. Instead, he openly accused Nick and the authorities of unlawfully detaining a law-abiding citizen, even citing multiple examples to support his claim. The unexpected testimony left the judge stunned, and due to insufficient evidence, he declared Shelton not guilty and ordered his release. Just as everyone thought the matter was about to end, Shelton suddenly clapped his hands and angrily shouted, "You're really going to let a murderer like me walk free? So you truly are ignorant and devoid of morality, with no concern for justice or right and wrong." It turned out that this very judge had presided over the case 10 years ago, and Shelton knew him to be utterly corrupt and without conscience. He seized the chance to berate him viciously in court, pushing the embarrassed judge into a rage so severe that he immediately retracted his ruling. Nick was left stunned. He had assumed Shelton was trying to fake insanity to escape punishment, but Shelton remained perfectly calm. Not only did he openly admit his crimes, he even revealed detailed accounts of how he had killed Darby. Yet after finishing, he coolly suggested another deal. At first, Nick dismissed it, reasoning that since Shelton had already confessed, there was no need to negotiate further. But just as he was about to leave, Shelton spoke a name, the lawyer who had defended Darby years ago. Nick confirmed the identity, and Shelton revealed that this man was now in his custody. If Nick wanted him alive, he would have to deliver a luxurious meal to Shelton at exactly 1 p.m. Otherwise, he warned, they might as well prepare to collect the man's corpse. This demand was as outrageous as the last, and like before, Nick assumed Shelton was just playing games. But after further investigation, they discovered that the lawyer had been missing for 3 days. To prevent any accidents, the police, in coordination with the prosecutor's office, conducted multiple checks and prepared to deliver the meal to Shelton as requested. However, the obstinate warden deliberately caused delays, and the delivery arrived several minutes late. Although Shelton had provided the address, by the time the officers reached the location, the lawyer was already dead, having passed just minutes earlier. Clearly, everything had been meticulously calculated by Shelton, leaving everyone stunned. How could a prisoner confined in a cell possibly orchestrate such a plan? Meanwhile, Shelton was casually sharing his feast with fellow inmates, but as his cellmate happily enjoyed the meal, Shelton used a steak bone to kill him instantly. He then lay back on his bed with composure, and even in front of the warden, he began making even more outrageous demands.
I need a shower.
On the other side, upon learning the news, Nick suddenly realized that Shelton was no ordinary adversary, yet he had no way of predicting Shelton's next move. It seemed that everyone was being manipulated entirely at Shelton's whim. To prevent further incidents, the police confined him alone in a small, dark cell. Nick confronted him, saying, "I can understand killing the lawyer, but why also kill your cellmate?" Shelton responded with a solemn expression, "Criminals beyond the reach of the law are my responsibility." Nick handed Shelton his daughter's bracelet, casually remarking, "Acts like this won't bring comfort to your deceased wife and daughter." But for Shelton, none of it mattered anymore. His wife and daughter would never feel anything again. In the following days, Nick's assistants finally made some progress, uncovering clues about Shelton's property. The district attorney also leveraged connections to find additional leads. It turned out that over the past decade, Shelton had been working for the government. By questioning his colleagues, Nick gained a clearer understanding of Shelton's true identity. He was essentially a government-trained operative with exceptional abilities, particularly a mind like a computer, skilled at planning and executing attacks from a distance. His colleagues warned Nick that even prison could not limit Shelton's actions, and anyone seeking to confront him needed to be fully prepared. Hearing this, Nick finally grasped the gravity of the situation. To prevent further accidents and to protect himself and his family, he could no longer afford to worry about law or justice. All he could focus on was ensuring Shelton faced the death penalty as quickly as possible. Determined, Nick and the district attorney approached the judge, asking her to find the relevant legal provisions so that Shelton could be dealt with lawfully and as quickly as possible. Remembering the humiliation she had suffered before, the judge readily agreed. Disposing of someone at will was practically her specialty. But as she picked up the phone, her head was instantly blown off. Witnessing the murder unfold before his eyes, Nick froze, immediately concluding that Shelton must have an accomplice outside who was carrying out these attacks. Acting fast, he sought to capture this accomplice while confronting Shelton once more, shouting, "Are you living just for revenge?" Shelton shot back just as loudly, "If this were mere revenge, why would I have waited 10 years? What I am fighting is a completely rotten judicial system." Nick felt a flicker of resonance. Indeed, the system was corrupt, but he knew that if Shelton persisted in his path, the punishment awaiting him would come from that very same corrupt system. As he was leaving, Shelton warned, "I'll give you one more chance. Release me at 6 tomorrow morning, or I will kill everyone." Naturally, Nick refused, resolving to confront Shelton to the end. For everyone's safety, he gathered all personnel in the office that night, while continuing to investigate Shelton's potential accomplices, knowing that Shelton could not openly strike. During the preparations, his female assistant asked whether he regretted the case from 10 years ago. Nick remained steadfast, insisting he had done nothing wrong, viewing his decisions as professional obligations. A high case closure rate was the pursuit of his life. As the clock ticked down to the final seconds before 6, everyone stared intently at the watch, tense and anxious. When the time arrived and nothing happened, their nerves finally eased. Nick smiled faintly, thinking the man might not be so difficult to handle. Believing they had survived, everyone began to leave for home, happily bidding Nick farewell and getting into their cars. But in the next instant, a vehicle suddenly exploded, followed by a series of consecutive blasts, killing several public officials, including the female assistant, in a meticulously orchestrated act of mass murder. Meanwhile, Shelton sat in his cell, clutching his daughter's bracelet tightly. The recent car explosions were entirely his doing. Investigations later revealed that every vehicle except Nick's had been rigged with bombs that would detonate upon ignition. Watching the flames engulf the scene, Nick realized this was Shelton's direct challenge to him. The situation escalated to the point that even the mayor could no longer stay calm. She could not believe that a prisoner could orchestrate such chaos, and feared that continued incidents would destroy the government under media scrutiny. Nick promised her that nothing like this would happen again, but he knew Shelton was far from an ordinary adversary, so he arranged for his wife and daughter to leave home for safety. Later, at home, Nick discovered a newspaper with a photograph of himself shaking hands with Darby, a blatant provocation from Shelton. Unable to contain his fury, Nick stormed to Shelton's cell and violently pinned him to the ground, beating him. Yet everything unfolded exactly as Shelton had anticipated. Facing the assault, Shelton merely smiled, saying, "Now you understand what it means to pursue justice. Why didn't you seek justice for my wife and daughter back then? Even if the outcome had been different, I could have accepted it." To Shelton, Nick's so-called efforts were nothing more than opportunistic maneuvers for personal gain. Though unwilling to admit his own mistakes, Nick's faith in his ideals and in the system began to crumble under the weight of Shelton's words. At the funeral of his assistant, Nick confided in the district attorney, lamenting how, in his youth, he had once been a passionate idealist, only to realize later how powerless one truly is within the system. When corruption becomes the norm, innocence becomes a liability, and maintaining one's integrity seems impossible. Nick had once hoped to reform the system, but in the end, the system reformed him. The district attorney, too, was resigned, aged, and disillusioned, fully aware of the system's decay, able only to endure and quietly bear the burden. Little did they know, these words would become his legacy. Despite taking precautions for the trip, every move they made had already been monitored by Shelton. After the funeral, as the group boarded their vehicles, a machine gun suddenly appeared in the cemetery, unleashing a frenzied barrage on the district attorney's car, instantly turning it into twisted scrap metal. A subsequent blast obliterated the vehicle completely. Once again, Nick witnessed a horrific massacre and failed to prevent the tragedy. Facing the mayor's reproach, he voluntarily submitted his resignation, but surprisingly, the mayor refused and instead appointed him as the new district attorney. To allow a single criminal to blur the lines between right and wrong would play directly into Shelton's hands. Determined to find Shelton's weakness, Nick revisited the case from 10 years ago, seeing the brutal deaths of Shelton's wife and daughter, and finally began to understand the motive behind Shelton's actions. Just as he felt at a loss, Nick received a mysterious email containing results his late assistant had uncovered, a detailed account of Shelton's property acquisitions over the past decade. By comparing this with the local property sales records from the same period, Nick successfully identified a target and immediately mobilized his team to investigate. This is an abandoned factory. Aside from some long-unused household items, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, as the investigation progressed, Nick discovered a brand new car. As the car slowly lifted, an opening appeared, and once it was powered, he realized it led to an underground passage. Nick continued to explore and, at the end of the passage, found a room that was essentially a small armory. It was filled not only with numerous surveillance cameras monitoring everything but also with all kinds of bombs and weapons. Moreover, this room held the truth. It was connected to the prison. The reason Shelton deliberately caused trouble and was held in isolation was to find a suitable location to carry out his plans. He never had accomplices and never killed anyone remotely with his mind. Everything that had happened before was solely his doing. Meanwhile, Shelton had already left the cell, successfully disguised as a janitor, and entered the city hall, which was about to hold a major meeting. He placed the bombs he brought in the right spots, intending to eliminate all high-ranking officials, including the mayor. On the other side, Nick discovered this plan at the base and rushed to City Hall. Since Shelton had various surveillance devices, Nick did not inform the mayor to avoid tipping him off and triggering an early detonation. With some time before the meeting began, Nick hurried to City Hall, but unfortunately, Shelton had already escaped, leaving behind only a box of bombs. These bombs were powerful enough to destroy the entire City Hall and would explode 30 seconds after a phone call, with extremely high difficulty in defusing them. Seeing this, Nick came up with a bold idea. Soon, key national officials arrived in the meeting room. Shelton had returned to the base and, watching the room through surveillance, did not immediately detonate the bombs but returned to his cell. What he did not expect was that Nick had been waiting there for a long time, hoping Shelton would not continue down the wrong path. Doing this will not only intensify your inner pain but also cost you your life. All I can do now is give you a way out. But Shelton believed he had no way out. All he wanted was to negotiate one more deal with Nick. This time, however, Nick made his stance clear: I will no longer negotiate with a killer. Hearing this, Shelton felt an unexpected sense of relief. He realized this had been his ultimate goal all along. Everything he had done before was not merely about revenge but about awakening the justice of the system and the law. Nick once again warned him not to detonate the bombs, or he would pay with his life. Yet at this point, Shelton had no choice. Sitting on the bed, he dialed the phone to trigger the explosion. Seeing this, Nick quickly got up, left the cell, and reinforced the door, even sealing off the tunnel entrance on the other side. Shelton suddenly sensed something was wrong. Upon searching, he discovered that the bomb box, which had been pre-placed in City Hall, was now right under his bed. When he tried to open it, he found it had been locked with handcuffs. In the next moment, his expression shifted from panic to peace. Holding his daughter's bracelet, he calmly accepted death amid the raging flames. At that moment, he was about to reunite with his family and, through his actions, upheld the dignity of law-abiding citizens. This 2009 American crime drama, directed by F. Gary Gray and starring Jamie Foxx and Gerard Butler, often sparks controversy over its ending. Many viewers feel that Shelton's death by explosion is abrupt and unnecessary. However, upon deeper reflection, this outcome is both realistic and inevitable. Shelton's original goal of revenge was to expose the darkness and flaws within the judicial system, hoping his actions would force institutional reform. Yet, after the murder of his wife and child, hatred gradually consumed him, and his actions began to deviate from his initial purpose. Perhaps his anger clouded his judgment, or perhaps he deliberately molded himself into a demonic figure to compel the system to confront its failures. Even though his motivation was rooted in justice, the bloody vengeance he enacted was not a socially acceptable solution. His internal struggle is evident in subtle details. His restraint during the killings, his hesitation at the moment of dialing the detonation, all show that he was not cold-blooded but constantly torn between ideals and reality. Shelton may have already understood that he was not merely a villain but a pawn sacrificing himself to awaken the judicial system. By choosing to end his life, he translated his ideals into action, using his death to deliver a warning to society. This character design is both absurd and profound. His story reflects the dilemmas of justice. The system, meant to protect citizens' rights and eliminate crime, often deviates from fairness due to focus on win rates and procedural loopholes. When justice ceases to be the core, law becomes a tool, allowing many criminals to evade accountability, which indirectly encourages crime. In reality, any of us could find ourselves under the shadow of the law, but unlike Shelton, we cannot confront the entire system alone, nor should we replace legal governance with violent retribution.